Hello and welcome also from my part. So I'm Maarit Koponen, Professor of Translation Studies here at University of Eastern Finland. And as said, my specialty area is translation technology. I've worked with machine translation, and I will get to the definitions in just a moment. All right, I will start with a little bit of terminology and why I am talking about automatic translation right now rather than machine translation. This is an area where I think terminology is in a flux at the moment. We have various different types of machine translation tools or translation tools, automatic translation, AI translation, whatever you wish to call them. So the ones on the left are probably what you are most used to thinking of when you hear the expression machine translation. We have your basic Google Translate, which is the one that usually people are familiar with, but there are also other tools. Here are just some examples, and I want to point out that none of these are intended as an advertisement, rather just illustrative examples of tools that can be used. So on the left side, your Google Translate and DeepL are what we could call nowadays traditional machine translation. So these tools work quite simply by entering some sort of source text, pressing a button, and at the other end you get a translated target text. More recently, we've seen other types of tools emerge in the field, so ChatGPT, Copilot, and various similar tools are generative AI powered by large language models. Now, I would say for the purposes of this talk, we can say that the main difference between your basic machine translation, Google Translate and similar, and a generative AI tool like ChatGPT or Copilot is that with these generative AI tools, you can also do other things. So you can ask them to, of course, generate text as the name implies in multiple languages. You can ask them to modify text, for example, give prompts to AI to simplify something, and so on. However, for this particular talk, I will be focusing on the use of generative AI for translation as such. So a scenario where you have some kind of a source text that is going to be translated into a target text. So I will not be talking so much about scenarios where you would be using it to generate any content as such. As you can see in some of these screenshots, when I talk about source text and target text, I don't necessarily mean just written text. So many of these tools can be used also in other ways, most notably for translating spoken language, speech. So as I was saying, when I talk about source text and target text, it can also be something other than written text. There are also newer tools that can deal with multimodal scenarios, such as video and so on. There in the lower right corner, I have included a couple of examples of tools that are perhaps more oriented towards a professional translator as a user. So these are so-called adaptive systems, which can, to at least some extent, also learn from corrections that a translator is making on the outputs. And now we're lost there. So you're probably familiar with headlines like these. These are all starting to be quite new, quite old at this point. I should get some newer screenshots as well. But this is something that I like to use to illustrate that over the years, we have seen so many times these predictions that machine translation or automatic translation or AI translation. For the sake of simplicity, I'll try to stick to automatic translation without necessarily limiting it to any specific type of tool. These tools are now approaching the level of human translators, or they have reached the level of human translators, or they have even surpassed or outperformed human translators. Now I could have a whole other lecture on what these headlines are actually based on, what are the studies that are usually behind these headlines, which give you evaluations where, let's say, according to some specific scoring, some machine translation system or AI system has now reached the same level. These are not by any means unproblematic, let's put it that way. So there are a lot of issues in these evaluations that should be taken into consideration. What I will say briefly is that whenever you see headlines like this, it's useful to give a bit of thought on what's actually going on there. Do you actually know what was evaluated, how it was evaluated, and what is happening behind the headlines? Now, regardless of all these headlines, and I have a bit of a collection myself. The earliest one I have that predicts that electronic translations, as it was called in the very, very early days, will be able to do what human translators do, is from 1954. So this has been coming in the next 5 to 10 years since the 1950s, and yet here we are. Now, despite these headlines, the basic challenge of translation has not disappeared. The basic challenge is meaning and how to disambiguate meaning. Here a screenshot, just for the fun of it, from an article that I happened to come across. Now, if you don't speak Finnish, you may be wondering, why is it that letterpress printers are so destructive to forests at this point? Now, the thing here is that the word kirjanpainaja there in Finnish actually means two different things. So it can mean a letterpress printer, as you see on the English translation. But what this article actually discusses is a type of a bug, which eats specifically fir trees in Finland, for example. So here our problem is that the machine translation system has not been able to disambiguate between these two meanings. It ends up using the wrong one. Now, some might say that this is an unfair test to the translation system. How would a human translator know either if the only thing they see is the word kirjanpainaja? My response to that is that a human translator is very, very rarely in a situation where you don't know what you are actually translating, so where you would only have isolated sentences. What you usually have is context, both the textual context, what is it that the rest of the text deals with, and also some kind of a translation brief, as we call it. So you have some kind of an explanation. What is this text about? Why am I translating this? Who am I translating this for? This is something that these automatic systems still, to a large extent, lack, even though there are tools that are able to take into account more than just a single sentence context. So this challenge is something that still remains. Another example, this one from a different article, dealing with a more biological issue, where the English fragment, again, seems quite plausible, right? So apparently there is some kind of a disease that has caused a major collapse in green pepper stock. Now the problem here, for those of you who speak Finnish have already noticed it, the ones who don't probably didn't, is this. The Finnish text is not actually dealing with green pepper, rather it is dealing with a type of bird, a green finch. Now why do we end up with this translation? Because obviously this is not a case of disambiguation as such. The word viherpeippo in Finnish does not have these two different meanings. It has only one meaning. It only means the bird. What's probably going on here is that the automatic translation system had not seen, so to speak, the word viherpeippo, or at least viherpeippokannassa, which is a compound word for the population of green finches. And therefore, it reverted back to so-called subword segments, which are combinations of letters in this case. If you look at the two Finnish words, viherpeippo, which is the bird, and viherpippuri, which is green peppercorn, it has a lot of the same letter sequences. So this functions, for the purposes of automatic translation, a case of similarity. For a human, of course, you can see that it shares the part that refers to green, so that would be the viher part, and some letter sequences, but you would not combine those two words as similar in the sense. I do get asked sometimes by machine translation developers whether my students, so I teach students of translation, sometimes I get asked, do my students make similar errors as these automatic systems? And this is something that I usually point to, that I don't think this is something that my student would do. Most likely what would happen is that the student would pick some other bird rather than translating a bird as pepper. Okay. Now I'll take a bit of a side tour into the generative systems, which, as said, you can ask them to do more things than just translate. As many of you can probably recognize, this is a somewhat old user interface of Microsoft's Copilot, but the age of the system is not the issue at this point. So here I've asked Copilot to translate a certain Finnish idiom, heittää lusikka nurkkaan, which, as it says there, literally means throwing a spoon into a corner. And quite helpfully, not just giving me a translation, Copilot has also added an explanation. This is the literal translation, however, this is how it's used. Now, the Finns are already looking at me quite puzzled here in the room. And those of you who do not speak Finnish may have also guessed that there's something going on here, which is that the explanation is wrong. So the literal translation is correct. However, this is not an idiom that is equivalent to throwing in the towel. Rather, in Finnish, to throw the spoon into a corner is a colloquial expression that means dying. So the explanation here is quite wrong, and if you would translate this expression as throw in the towel, you are conveying a completely different meaning. Okay. Well, as said, some of these may have already been things that you are able to guess or spot, even without knowing Finnish. But here's one more example. This is from Twitter. Unfortunately, I don't have the original source there on the screenshot, but it is a screenshot from Twitter from early 2022. Some of you may remember this news story where President Zelensky of Ukraine had been offered by the Americans a ride out of Kiev for safety. And you have a Finnish person there posting a tweet commenting on this news story. And there, as you can see, Twitter at that point offered a Google translation into English. Now, even if you don't understand the original Finnish tweets, there are some things that you might notice that give you a clue that there is something going on here. So ways that you can potentially spot or at least suspect that something may have gone wrong is looking at the grammar. So if you look there at the point where it says in the translation, be able to stay on the front line in his grip. There, the grammatical structure of the English sentence suggests that there's something wrong here. Something doesn't quite work. If you compare it to the Finnish, you'll probably notice the word Kalashnikov, referring to a certain type of gun, and that may lead you to guess, okay, maybe that's the word that is missing. So that's one way you can spot that, okay, something might not be right. You might use context. For example, when you look at the very first sentence translated, who is it actually who needed ammunition and not a ride? The sentence is perfectly fluent, but if you think about the context of what is happening here, so the Americans actually offered, not provided, so there's another mistake there. Provided implies that Zelensky took their offer, which is not what the Finnish tweet says and also not what happened. But the grammatical structure there implies that it's the Americans who need ammunition, when what is actually happening in this case is that Zelensky said he needs ammunition. This point is something that you can also perhaps notice if you have background knowledge of what actually happened and were able to see news from other sources. So you may notice that the first sentence here is mistranslated. It reverses the meaning in a sense there, and also, as I said, the actual translation would be that the Americans offered a ride, not that they provided it, because the offer was not accepted. So these are some of the things you can use to figure out that something might have gone wrong. However, there's one more thing that might not be so obvious, which is, what is it that this Finnish poster is actually trying to say? If you read the English version of the tweet, even considering these issues that you may have noticed, it sounds like a very straightforward statement, whereas for a Finnish speaker, the original one is very, very clearly sarcastic. So this is not something where you think that it might be. It is from the word choices and the phrasing. It is very, very clear that this is a sarcastic joke. So if you are relying on the English one and you get the impression that the last statement for yes is the poster's actual opinion, you are getting a completely different idea from what the original tweet actually says. Okay, why am I going through these issues here? Because it's fun. That's always the best part of talking about automatic translation is fun examples. But there is also an actual point that I want to get you thinking about whenever you are considering the use of automatic translation, which is that, as I said, these translation errors have not disappeared. Regardless of what you see in the news or hear in presentations about the quality of automatic translation, these types of issues still exist and will continue to exist. As long as language is ambiguous, you will have problems with disambiguating meaning. And these examples are also intended to address two aspects of translation errors that can occur. So this is a distinction we make in translation studies when talking about translation quality and translation errors in general. On the one hand, you have errors of fluency that affect the language of the target text. On the other hand, you have errors of accuracy that affect the meaning, the content, what is actually being said. And this is an analogy that already comes from the 90s, from Sergei Nierenberg and his colleagues, which I like to use to illustrate the difference. And the so-called cookie jar analogy they use goes like this. Imagine you have a jar of cookies. Let's say it has 100 cookies. Some of those cookies are a little bit burnt or misshapen. They didn't quite come out looking right, but they're still perfectly good cookies. They taste fine. You'll still be happy to have one with your coffee or whatever. Those are your fluency or language errors. It might not be pretty, but it's still perfectly serviceable. On the other hand, and I don't know how Nierenberg and colleagues cook, but this is their analogy. On the other hand, imagine that somehow some of those cookies have poison in them, but you can't tell from looking at them. They look exactly the same as all the other cookies. These poison cookies, in their analogy, are the errors of meaning or accuracy. So the ones that actually affect the content of what is being said. And the important point here is that fluency does not equal accuracy. So what this means is that especially with current systems that use neural networks and these large language models, you have very, very fluent translations. They often look very convincing. There aren't these clear grammatical errors, for example, that you would immediately notice and be able to say, okay, there's something wrong here. But you might still have major errors in meaning. Things that are quite commonly brought up as examples is that the word not, for example, or any sort of negation is one that can easily disappear or appear. So you will get situations where the machine translated text actually says the complete opposite of what the source text says. And one of the things that, as I also sometimes end up in discussions with the developer side is like, well, what's an acceptable rate of errors? And the only thing I can say is, I don't know. How many poison cookies are you willing to accept? That's perhaps a bit of a glib way of putting it. But the key point also becomes like, what is, not the risk of translation error as such. This is something that I have discussed with my colleague Mari Nurminen. We wrote a chapter together on risk management of machine translated information. And where we ended up with was that having an error in the translation is not a risk. It's basically guaranteed. If you have a long enough text that you're translating, I can pretty much guarantee that there's going to be some kind of an error in there. The risk is what happens when there is an error. In some cases, if you're having just an informal chat with someone, it might not be that dramatic. On the other hand, and we're moving towards the question of how and whether automatic translation can help researchers. You can probably think about a lot of situations as a researcher where an error in the translations could have quite significant effects on your study. Then if we go into other scenarios, there might be cases where somebody's life is on the line. The wrong translation error in the wrong place might actually lead to physical harm. Right. Another important thing to understand about quality and errors is that it is very strongly affected by, first of all, the text type. What is it that you are trying to translate? Usually, any sort of automatic translation works best for rather formal written language. Formal in quotes, in that there is kind of like this extreme end of institutional jargon that is extremely formal and usually does not work that well with automatic translation, but something that is more to the formal side of things rather than very, very informal colloquial language. For example, the Twitter example I had there, these kinds of very short micro-blog texts, as they're called. So you have a short text which might not have like very structured, well-formed sentences. Those can be challenging for any automatic system. Transcribed speech is usually more difficult for translation, also for interpreters. Speech is more difficult than dealing with written text. Because speech, if you now, well, you can do this after the fact. You can listen to the recording and notice, for example, that I keep stopping what I'm saying. I start a different sentence. There aren't necessarily these clearly formed sentences, which is something that the automatic translation systems tend to be trained with. So we go to the training data and what has been used in these systems. They usually expect something along the lines of this kind of formal written type of language. And therefore, when you have, let's say, speech that is more meandering, or if you have very, very figurative language, idioms, humor, sarcasm, these systems are not necessarily so good at detecting something like that. Specialized terminology, this does to some extent depend on what system you are using, especially these openly available tools, which tend to be what most people are using. They're not that good at handling specialist terminology, which is something that you as a researcher are probably dealing with. There are customized solutions, not necessarily for researchers, but for various different text types that have been specifically trained or at least fine-tuned using data sets that contain specialist terminology, but you cannot expect that same from your basic Google Translate, as you would from, let's say, the World Intellectual Property Organization, for example, has their own system, which has been trained with patent texts. And it's very good at translating patent texts, but not necessarily for anything else. The question of public information and sensitive information is a slightly different point. It doesn't relate so much to quality, but rather the fact that these, again, openly available online translators, which most people tend to use, don't have that great data security. There have been cases where texts or other information fed into online translation systems have then leaked, containing, let's say, people's personal sensitive information, containing confidential information from companies or other organizations. So if you are dealing with any sort of sensitive information, which is something that could well come up for a researcher, let's say you have research participants and you have their personal information, don't put it into open Google Translate or ChatGPT or anything like that. At that point, you'll want to be working with some kind of a closed system. It's not that these companies specifically intend to share that information, but these data sets can and have been leaked. Another aspect that affects translation quality is the language pair. And here, something that is quite important to understand is that translation quality varies hugely depending on which languages you are using. The examples I showed previously were between Finnish and English. One of the kind of key rules of thumb is that usually any language pair that involves English is going to work better than language pairs between other languages. Let's say in the Finnish context, for example, Finnish and Swedish. Even though Finnish and Swedish are the national languages of Finland, actually automatic translation between Finnish and English and Swedish and English works a lot better than directly between Finnish and Swedish because of the fact that data sets involving English are much larger and can be used for training. There were specific projects I won't go into that were focused on collecting Finnish, Swedish data sets, which were able to improve the situation. So it's not quite the same as it was some time ago. But even if we talk about something like Finnish and Swedish, I've heard people say that Finnish is a low resource language. I don't quite agree with that. It's definitely not a high resource language, so a language for which you have a lot of these digital data sets and language resources available. The number of languages that can be considered properly high resource is approximately 5. So English is up there, and then depending on which source you are using, they usually list other languages like Spanish, Chinese, and a few other languages. Finnish is probably somewhere in the middle. Then if we go to truly low resource languages, the situation is completely different. For example, one of the special areas that the University of Eastern Finland works with is Karelian language, which is an indigenous minority language in Finland, which does not have a written standard. There are different dialects of Karelian that have their written language to varying extents. And you can find some tools. For example, if you try with ChatGPT and say, translate this into Karelian, it will give you a translated text and say, this is Karelian. I don't speak any Karelian myself, but I do have colleagues here who do, who are native speakers even. And I've done some little tests with that and asked them, like, what do you actually say about this? How good is the Karelian translation? The responses vary between it's sort of recognizable as Karelian to it's completely unintelligible. So even if some tool claims that it supports a given language or a language pair, you might want to be a bit careful about the quality. And here we also come to this very important distinction of, or the question of whether you actually understand the languages you are using when you translate. So the source language, the language you are translating from, is it a language you understand very well, or at least to some extent, or just a little, or maybe not at all? What about the target language? Is it a language you understand very well, or at least to some extent, or just a little, or maybe not at all? The reason why this is important to think about is that if you are translating from a language you do not understand at all, then it is quite difficult to actually evaluate whether you are getting correct information in the automatically translated target. On the other hand, if you are translating into a target language that you do not understand at all, or only very little, then you have no idea what the translation is actually saying and what the other person that you are presumably translating this for is going to understand. Okay. Now, before I go into the questions of what this all means for a researcher, I just wanted to quickly return to this question of thinking about what tool you are actually using for the automatic translation. Is it a generic or a customized tool? So these open online translators, they are so-called generic tools. They're not trained for any specific type of text, but there are also options out there that are customized for some specific text type and purpose. Free online versus proprietary. So here, for example, the important question is data protection. If it's free online system, then do not put any sensitive information in the translator. But there are also solutions that are closed and proprietary, where the things put into the translation system stay within your own organization. So consider whether that is something that you actually need. Static versus interactive or adaptive, I just wanted to bring this up as an interesting point, that most of the tools that you will probably work with are so-called static MT or static translation systems, which you enter the text and you can get output back and it doesn't change. I mentioned briefly that there are also systems out there that can, to some extent, adapt to changes made to them, and even interactively, as you start changing something, it changes to what you do, but that is more of a rare thing to encounter. Okay, now moving closer to the perspective of a researcher. First of all, there is a rather old distinction of use scenarios for machine translation or automatic translation, going back already several decades. We can think about scenarios where you would use automatic translation in terms of three distinct activities. The first one is dissemination, which means basically that the reason why you are translating something is that you intend to provide information or whatever content it is that you are translating to some other person. Usually in this case, you are working from a language that you understand very well into a language that you probably don't, at least not to the same extent. The other counterpart of that is what we call assimilation, which means that you're not sending the information to somebody else. Rather, you yourself want to access information that is most likely in a language that you do not understand, at least not very well. So you are translating it into a language that you do understand. The final one usually used in this distinctions is communication, which would imply a situation where you have two or more people in the same situation or scenario, not necessarily physically present in the same place, but in some kind of active communication with each other. And the way this differs from dissemination and assimilation is that in the dissemination and assimilation scenarios, the assumption is that the parties are so far removed from each other that they cannot directly communicate. For example, you cannot easily ask, is this what you meant? Whereas if you have a communicative situation where you are speaking in the same physical space, over the phone, through a chat, whatever it may be, you can directly check with the other person what they meant. Now, what could this mean for a researcher? I'll go through a few example cases of how these scenarios could come up for a researcher. Many of these are cases that I have personally encountered myself or know from colleagues. So one of the things we do as researchers, we do literature reviews, right? So we read things written by others and try to find sources for our own research. So let's say we have a scenario here where a researcher is conducting a literature review and comes across some sources that would be potentially interesting, but they are written in a language that the researcher does not understand, at least not that well. This would be a case of assimilation, so you're just intending to use this information for yourself. Some of the things to consider here is, do you have any knowledge of the source language? Is it something that you do not understand at all, or do you understand at least a little bit? How familiar are you with the topic? What other resources do you have that might support your understanding of the source? So this is a real-life scenario that could come up. My recommendation, in a sense, would be that you can use automatic translation for a sort of the triage. So trying to identify and select which, if any, of these sources are potentially useful and interesting. However, at least personally, I would not rely on machine translation alone. So I would never cite in a paper I write that this other researcher says this, unless I have other ways of confirming that is what they say. I have used this type of thing myself with, well, not fully for a case where I did not understand the language at all, but for example, reading some sources written in Spanish, and I used machine translation as the help of reading the text in full. However, I have studied some Spanish. I can actually understand some. It was on a topic that I was very, very familiar with, sources on post-editing, for example. And there were cases where, when I absolutely wanted to be sure that I'm not going to misquote someone, I checked in with a colleague who understands Spanish better than I do. Am I understanding this correctly? So not relying on the machine translation alone, but figuring out what parts might be relevant to you. Another scenario, conducting a survey, and you need the questionnaire translated into multiple languages. This is actually a case that is currently ongoing in my own work. With my colleague, we have launched a survey for Finnish public administration. And we wanted to have the survey both in Finnish and in Swedish, which are the two national languages. However, neither one of us is particularly confident in our Swedish skills. It is something that is required, that we learn, but for example, I end up using Swedish so rarely that if I have to actually write something in Swedish, it becomes very, very difficult. So this would be a case of dissemination in the sense that you are sending something out to the people you hope to be respondents in your survey. Again, consider your knowledge of the target language. Machine translating something into a language you do not speak at all and just sending that out there sounds like a very, very bad idea, at least to me. I would not want to do it. I have come across cases where I think that is what has happened. I don't want to kind of publicly name any specific cases, but I will just vaguely mention that there is a rather widely used questionnaire, which is, I believe, originally in German and has been translated into multiple languages. The English translation, for example, it seems good to me. There is also a Finnish translation, which I very strongly suspect has been made with machine translation. Some of the word choices are very strange. Usually these are situations where, yes, that is a possible translation for that English word, but a Finnish speaker would never use it in this context. Another telltale issue is that the phrasing keeps switching between different Finnish cases. So in case you didn't know, Finnish nouns have, depending on exactly who you ask and how you count, either 14 or 15 distinct cases. And it arbitrarily keeps switching between these different cases, which when you are reading it as a Finnish speaker is very, very strange and very annoying. So I don't think that's a good idea to send a survey like that out there. So you need to consider also the impact of translation errors. On the one hand, if you send a machine translated survey, are the respondents going to actually understand what you are asking? Translating something like surveys is a very, very difficult thing. We've also worked with cases where we had to spend with a group of researchers quite a bit of time discussing the exact wordings and nuances of a translation. On the other hand, even if they would understand what you are asking, in the case of this survey I mentioned, most of it is understandable. I can figure out what they're asking, but as I said, as a fan, something like that where it keeps switching the case for no particular reason is very, very annoying. So is that the perception that you want your respondent to have, is that this is a really badly translated questionnaire? So what did we end up doing with this Swedish translation, for example? Well, actually, the most of the questionnaire was professionally translated by someone. But we ended up in a situation where at the very end, we wanted to add or modify a few questions, and we simply didn't have time to send it out to a translator again. So what we did was create these additional pieces with the help of machine translation, my knowledge of Swedish to the extent that it works, and then went to colleagues who speak Swedish as their mother tongue and asked, hey, is this okay if I put it like this? And we got responses back like, okay, well, it's not bad, but maybe you want to change it like this. So maybe this could work. So have a raw version, but then have it checked by someone who actually speaks the language. Another example, this time from my colleague Mari Nurminen. I have the reference later on the slide. So Mary's case was that she wanted to interview some users of machine translation, and they did not share a common language. So this was done in English and Spanish. So this is a case of communication. Mary used Skype's instant messages, which had English to Spanish machine translation. However, something she points out in the article that is cited there is that actually both parties knew the other language to some extent. So this helped them kind of monitor what was happening in the machine translation and figure out that, okay, this must have been mistranslated. She talks about ways to manage understanding in this situation, so-called negotiating the meaning. So rephrasing things, asking the other party, is this what you meant? This is what I understood. Was this what you wanted to say? Or if you notice that the other person's responses are kind of strange, then trying to rephrase what you said in a different way. So negotiating the meaning, adapting your messages in real time as you see what is happening. It's an interesting article that I do recommend. Nurminen brings up also other considerations such as the availability of suitable tools, which might be an issue, especially when you consider these low resource languages. You might not have any tool available, or the quality might be so poor that it simply is not workable. English to Spanish is probably one of the best quality machine translation language pairs that you're going to get. Nurminen also makes the suggestion to consider other support materials. For example, have your interview structure professionally translated into the other language and send that to the interviewee beforehand. This way you can establish the topic and also some terminology so that you are kind of like on the same page. All right, I know we're getting close to the end, but a couple of more quick examples. This is also something that happened in a project that I'm currently working on. We have collected some data from these information search simulations with target groups who speak Russian and Ukrainian. One of the key researchers involved in this study actually does not speak Ukrainian or Russian. So how does this researcher then analyze the data that has been collected in this kind of, so there is this think aloud interview type of material. So this is a case of, again, a simulation, trying to find, use the information yourself rather than providing it to somebody else. And what we actually did in this case was to use machine translation for so-called triage. So when we have the transcripts of the think alouds and then the interview parts, use machine translation to translate that into a language that our researcher can understand, and then find the bets that are relevant for a specific point in the analysis. But then those are analyzed in collaboration with another researcher who does speak the languages in question. So also here you want to think about knowledge of the language, what type of text you are dealing with. And then also something that is quite important. If you are using machine translation to analyze anything, are you analyzing what is said? So you're more likely to get the gist of it, so the point of what is being said. Or are you analyzing how something is said? So remember that machine translation can actually significantly change, for example, the tone of something. So I would not conduct, for example, a discourse analysis based on machine translation, because the discourse of the automatically translated version is probably going to be not exactly the same as what it was in the source language. Okay, final point that may interest some of you. What if you want to write an article and you are not that confident in writing? Here I want to refer you to some sources by other colleagues who have been investigating the case of using machine translation as a tool for academic writing. And again, as I said in the beginning, I'm not talking about using generative AI to produce your whole article, which would be a completely different thing in terms of ethics, but rather a situation where you have written the text in one language and then use machine translation to translate it into another language. In the works of Bowker and Buitrago-Zero and then O'Brien and colleagues, the situation is very often that you are expected to write in English without being a native English speaker. So here the case is, again, dissemination. Again, an important consideration. How well do you know the target language? Are you actually able to evaluate how good the translation is? What other resources do you have available to help you with this academic writing? And what this would mostly mean is a case of post-editing. So where you generate a raw version of the text and then work on that by correcting any issues that need to be corrected. I haven't directly used post-editing in this sense, but we do have an interesting case with, again, my colleague Meri Nurminen, where we worked on a pair of articles, one of which is in Finnish and the other one is in English. And there are bits and pieces in both of those articles where Meri had written something in English and it was translated into Finnish for purposes of the Finnish article, and then other way around where we had some bits and pieces in Finnish which were machine translated into English. But those were kind of like, I wouldn't even call it post-editing as such. So it was, I don't think even a sentence of what was generated by the machine translation ended up directly into either of these articles. It was more just kind of support to get over the point where you just have a blank page and nothing else. All right, I will quickly conclude here. So automatic translation can be a useful tool also for a researcher, but it's very important to understand the possibilities and limitations. And if you only remember one thing from this whole talk, I hope it will be this: fluency does not guarantee accuracy. These are two completely different things. I hope that the example cases I've run through here help you think about some of these questions. What's your scenario where you're using the automatic translation? What are you translating? Why are you translating it? What are the potential consequences in your scenario, and how you can best manage those risks and consequences? You will get the slides later, so you don't need to try and copy the references right now. And I want to thank the YUFE Academy for organizing this. Thank you all for attending, and I hope we are able to take at least a couple of quick questions at the end, because we had some technical issues there to deal with. Thank you.